Hello, my name is PigeonNo12, and today we're going to learn how to create a script that is going to help you make informed decisions in terms of how to modify your environment based on the retention and time the players stay in your world. To start, let's create a fictional layout of how the world looks like. So we're going to be using tubes in this case. Again, there's just a random preference. We're going to be using this to have kind of like a visual representation of where those areas are going to be. I'm going to just paint them as orange because why not? There. And then we're going to have two additional areas like so. Let me actually duplicate this one here. Then we're going to add a trigger to each one of those areas. This is where we're going to be running the scripts. And let's actually name them so we know what they represent. So one could be a bar. Tiny bit smaller. The other one could be a dance floor. And then the other one could be a representation of the VIP area. Like so. For this exercise, the objective is to track how much time people spend in one of those areas. To start, let's start creating the first script. So I'm going to open my build menu, then go to the gizmos section, and I'm going to bring a script gizmo. I'm going to open the script gizmo to start entering the data. First, let's start by creating the variables that we're going to need in this script. We click on new variable, and then this one is going to be called do not track. And this is going to be a string type and a list. And here we're going to put the names of the players that we do not want to track in the script. Next, we're going to create a variable called players quantity. And this is going to be a number. Next, we're going to create the variable called total time. This is going to be a number as well. We're also going to need a variable called dashboard. And this is going to be a reference to the object that is going to be showing the results. Then we're going to need a area name variable. This is going to be a string. Also, we are going to need a is tracking boolean. It's going to be a boolean type. And an excluded players variable. And the type for this one is going to be player type. And this is going to be a list. Okay, so let's get into the meat of this script. First, when the world starts, we want to send an event. And we go into the events tab and send event to object. And this one is going to be called register area. We are going to send this event to the dashboard, and we're going to send it with the variable called area name. Right after that, we're going to kick off an event that is going to be called report time. and this is going to be sent to self after 5 seconds. Next, we need to start tracking when the players enter and leave the area. So for that, we're going to go into the player events, and then we're going to bring the one called when trigger is entered by player. In here, we first are going to check if the name of the player is in that do not track list. If the name of the player is not in the list of do not track, as we're doing here with these code blocks, using the code blocks not list contains items, the name of the list, and the name of the player, like so. We're gonna then count that player in the player's quantity variable. So we're gonna set player's quantity to be equals to player's quantity plus 1. Immediately after that, if we are not yet tracking the time, we're going to be using the not code block here as a condition, and the is tracking boolean as a condition as well. We're going to then start tracking the time in this area. So we're going to send an event to self with delay, and this is going to be called track time. We're going to send it with 1 second delay, but we need to make sure that that boolean is now set to true. So we're going to be using a set to code block and a boolean input, changing it to true, to make sure that whenever someone else enters that area, this event is not triggered again. So we're going to change that to true. Perfect. Okay, so that's the condition if the player is not in that exclusion list. If that player it is in the exclusion list, then we're going to be using an else statement to add that player ID into the excluded players list. So we're going into the operators and then add to list, and we add that value, which is the player ID, into the excluded players list, like so. Now that we have completed this part of the code, we're gonna do the opposite, evaluating when the player leaves the trigger. So we're gonna be using a code block that is under the player events, and this one is going to be when trigger is exited by player. We first are going to evaluate if that player is not in that exclusion list. So we're gonna be using an if statement and the not operator and the code block that checks if someone is in the list. So in this case, list contains item. The list is the list of excluded players, and the item that we want to check is the player itself. If that is the case, we can then go ahead and use a set to code block event to deduct the number of players by 1. So it's going to be player quantity is equals to players quantity minus 1. And immediately after, we're going to check if we are already into that value of 0 for the players quantity. So in this case, we're going to be using an equals players quantity under A and 0 for B. If that is the case, it's okay to change the value of the boolean is tracking to false. And to complete this logic here, let's add an else statement that is going to be connected to the first if statement here to simply remove that player from the list of excluded players. And just to make sure that we complete the evaluation here, we need to add an else statement. And in the else statement, we're just gonna simply eliminate that record from the excluded list of players. So we're going to the Operators tab, and then we bring the code block called remove item from list. And we're going to remove the item called player ID from the list of excluded players. After completing all of that, let's go ahead and complete the logic for the loop called track time. Remember that we're sending this event to self after 1 second. In order to do that, we go into the Events tab, and then we bring the code block called when event is received, and we replace my event with track time. And basically, all we need here is to add an if statement, and only if the Boolean is tracking is set to true, we're gonna add 1 unit to the track time or total time. So we're gonna be using a set to code block here to set the value of total time to be equals to total time plus the number of players that are in that area. And then we're gonna repeat that loop every second. So we're gonna send an event with delay, and the event is gonna be called track time to self after 1 second. The last portion of this script is to complete the logic of the report time event that we sent when world started after 5 seconds. So we're gonna go all the way to the bottom, and then we're gonna add a when event is received. And this event, as I mentioned before, is called report time. And when we receive that event, we're gonna be sending an event without delay using the same name, report time. We're gonna be sending this to the dashboard. And we're gonna be sending this event, in this case, with the name of the area that is reporting the time, as well as the total time reported by that area. And we're gonna continue this loop every 5 seconds. So we need to add at the bottom of it an event with delay, which is gonna be the report time to self after 5 seconds. Before we end this script, let's make sure that we name it correctly. And this one, I'm gonna be calling it area script. So now we completed that area script. Let's go ahead and create a script that is gonna be running on the dashboard itself. So I'm gonna open my build menu, and I'm gonna bring another script gizmo, and I'm gonna rename this one right away to be called dashboard script. Now let's move on to this variables tab to start adding all the variables that we're going to be needing for this script. Let's click on the new variable button, and let's create the variable do not track. And again, this is where you're going to be putting all the names of all the players that you will then want to track in your script. Let's say collaborators or your own name. And this is going to be a string and a list. Next, we're going to be adding the players quantity variable. And this is going to be a number. We're going to be creating the total time variable. And this is going to be a number as well. And areas variable. And this is going to be a list of strings. A number variable that is going to be called received data, and this is going to be a number as well. A variable called bars, and this is the one that we're going to be using to create a graph of the data that we're receiving, and this is going to be a list of strings. We are also going to create a variable called message, and this is going to be the string, the full strength of everything that is going to be printed in the dashboard, and this is going to be a string. Next, we're going to create an iterator. This is going to be a number. We also are going to need an accumulated variable, and this is going to be a number. We also going to create another variable called %. And this is going to be a list of numbers. We also going to need to click on new variable to create another one called area time. And this is going to be a list of numbers. Let's create another one called data index. And this is going to be a number as well. Another one that is going to be called total area time. And this is going to be a number. A bar index. And this is going to be a number. And lastly, we're going to create a list called excluded players. And this is going to be a list of players. So for the script itself, the very first thing that we want to do is that when world starts, we need to kick off that track time loop. So we go into the events tab, and then we send an event to object, and this event is going to be called track time, similar to what we used in the areas script, and this is going to be sent to self. Later on, we're going to develop what happens when we receive that event. We also, similar to what we did in the areas, we need to track when the players enter and leave the world. In the area side, we tracked when the players enter and left the triggers. In this case, we're going to be tracking when the players enter and leave the world. So for that, we're going to go into the events tab, and then we're going to scroll until we find the player events, and we're going to bring the one called when player enters the world. Here, we're going to follow the same process. We're going to do if the name of that player is not in the list of do not track. So let me bring the code blocks that are required for that. For this, I'm going to need the code block called list contains item. And the list that we're going to be tracking is the one called do not track. And contains, we're going to check if it contains the name of the player. So we're going to be using name of player here. If that is the case, we simply are going to set the value of player quantity to be equals to player quantity plus 1. If not, we're going to be adding an else statement here to then add that players to the list of excluded players. So for this as well, just to avoid redundancy, we're going to be using an if statement, and only if that player hasn't been added yet to the list. So we're going to be using a not here. And again, the list contains item code block. So if the list of excluded players doesn't yet contains the player ID, we're gonna add that player to that list. So add player to the list of excluded players. Next, we need to do the opposite when the player leaves the world. So when the player leaves the world, we go into the events tab, we go into the players events, and then we bring the code block called when world is exited by player. In here, we're going to be checking if the player is not in the list of excluded players. Just going to copy the same logic that we had before. We are going to set the value of players quantity to be equals to player quantity minus 1. Otherwise, we're just gonna simply remove that element from the list of excluded players. So we're gonna go into the list group and we're gonna remove item from list. So the item that we want to remove is the player from the list of excluded players. Now that we have this part covered, let's go ahead and create the logic of the track time event. So we're gonna go into the events tab and bring the code block called when event is received, and we're gonna select that event called track time. Similar to what we did with the areas script, we're basically gonna use a set to code block here to set the value of total time to be equal to total time plus player quantity. And we're gonna repeat that loop every second. So we're gonna be using a send event to self with delay. So we're gonna be using send event with delay. And this is going to be track time after 1 second. Next, let's go ahead and process what happens when an area sends the event to the dashboard to register itself. So basically we're gonna add a when event is received, and from here we're gonna select the event that we created earlier called register area. And remember that we sent this event with a variable or parameter called area name. So we're gonna go ahead and create it here as well. And the type was a string. After we receive that, and to make sure that we don't add multiple areas with the same name, we're gonna add an if statement here, and we're gonna check that that name hasn't been added yet to the list. So we're gonna be using a not statement here, and just as we did before with the players, we're gonna scroll down to the list group and bring the code block called list contains item. And the list that we want to check in this case is the one called areas. And the value that we want to check is the area name. So if that area hasn't been added to the areas list yet, we're gonna go ahead and add one record to that list with the area name. So if that area hasn't been added to the list yet, we're gonna go ahead and use the code block called add to list. And the value that we want to add is the area name, and we want to add that to the areas list. We also want to add 2 additional records to 2 different lists. One of them is going to be the list called percents, and the other one is going to be called the variable that we created called area time. And to both of them, we're going to just be adding a placeholder value of 0. Now, let's process what happens when we receive the event called report time from the areas. So we go into the events tab, and then we bring the code block called when event is received. And the event that we're going to be processing here is the one called report time. Remember that from the areas, we sent 2 parameters. One of them was the area name. This was a string. And the other variable was time. And this was a number. After we receive that event, the very first thing that we want to do is that we want to identify what is the index of that area. So for that, we're going to be using a set to code block to set the value of data index to be equals, scroll to the list group here, and we're gonna get the code block called index of item in list. The item that we want to check is the area name, and we want to find it in the list called areas. After doing that, we also are going to keep track of how many reports we have received. And for that, we're going to be using the variable called receive data. And we're basically are going to set the value of that variable to be equals to receive data plus 1. I'm going to add a number 1 here. Oh, and we want to make sure that we have the list here as well. After doing that, we are going to check if the current total time is equals to 0. And we're going to do total time equals 0. And if that is the case, we are going to set the value at this moment using the list code block called set value at index in list. We're going to set the value equals to 0 at index data index in the list called area time. Otherwise, we're going to be using an else statement for that. We're going to use the same code block here that we used before, but instead of 0, we're going to be saving the total time that we have here with the variable called time. And we are also going to say set value at index in list. In this case, we're going to set the value to be equals to a ratio, which is going to be equivalent to the time divided by the total time. We're going to set it at index data index, and we're going to be saving this value in the list called %. After completing this step, let's go ahead and validate if we have already received all the data that we need to start summarizing the data. So we're going to be using an if statement here, and we are going to check if the value of received data is equals to the length of the list of areas that we're reviewing. So we're going to be using length of list here and areas for the list. If that is the case, we're going to reset the value of received data. So we're going to set to receive data to be equals to 0. And we are going to kick off an event called summarize data. So in here, I'm going to be adding an event called summarize data. Summarize. So next, we are going to bring the code block called when event is received. We're going to receive that event called summarize. And after receiving that event, the very first thing that we want to do is that we want to set the heading of the message that we're going to be printing in the dashboard. So for that, we're going to be using a set to code block to set the value of message to be equals to a string input, which is going to be M space, and this is going to make sure that we have the same spacing for all the characters in the message. So M space, and just for testing purposes, we're going to be using a 0.2. We might need to adjust this value later, depending on the size of the dashboard. And we will also use the align keyword to make sure that everything is aligned to the left. And we're gonna just print results for now. I'm gonna say column here and enter. Next, we are going to reset the value of all the variables that we have in here. So we're going to be using the set to code block here. And we're going to reset the value of accumulated to be equals to 0. We are also going to set to 0 the value of total area time. And we will also reset the value of iterator to be equals to 0. After doing all of that, we're going to send an event to self by sending an event to object, and this one is going to be called build message right here, as we have it right here in this drop down, build a message. We will then receive that event called build message, and we are going to check as the very first step that iterator that we're going to be using to loop through the list of areas is still less than the length of items or the list of items that we have in that list. So we're going to be using a less than, and we're going to evaluate that the iterator is less than the length of that list. So we're going to be using length of list, and the list is going to be the areas. Now, if that is the case, we want to set the value now of bar index, which is the variable that we created right here called bar index, to be equal to the rounded value. So for that, we're going to be using the code block called floor of multiplying the value of the percents. So we're going to be using the get item from list where the number is going to be the iterator, and then the list is going to be the percents list, and we're going to multiply that value by 10. And I'm going to explain what that means in a sec. So for the dashboard, we're going to be using a bar graph. They're going to be seeing the final results. And for that, we're going to be using a trick, which is having a list of bars, predefined bars, in this variable called bars, right? Which is a list of strings. So for that, we're going to be using the index as the count of how many bars we are going to be presenting in the dashboard. And then as the value, we're going to be using symbols. In this case, if we don't have any bars, we're just going to fill that string with 10 periods. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 periods. But if, for example, the index now is 1, the context of that string is going to be a pipe and 9 periods. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. There you go, 10. And you get the idea. If we have an index of 2, we're going to have 2 pipes and 8 periods. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and enter. So I'm just going to do that 10 times. 5 is going to be 5 bars. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 5 periods. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, and 1 period. And the last one is going to be a number 10, which is 10 bars. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Perfect. So by doing this calculation here, we are able to associate a representation, a graph representation of this index using the current value of the percent of that area. After doing that, let's go ahead and set the value of another one of the variables. This variable this time is going to be the one called accumulated. And this one is going to be equals to adding the value of itself with the var index. This is going to help us to create a graph representation for everything else that is not one of the areas that we are tracking. Similarly, we're going to be using another set to code block here to set the value of total area time to be equals to adding the total area time plus the get item from list. The item that we're going to get is the number iterator. from the list called area time. And after doing that, we can now set the value, the updated value of the message, to be equals to the concatenation, and for that we're going to be using the plus sign to be able to concatenate strings, to the current value of the message, because remember that we're going to be running this in a loop, plus another concatenation sign here, which is going to be the plus sign. We're going to be adding for each record breakpoint or break line. So for that, the value is going to be less than, BR, greater than. Next, we're going to be getting another few concatenation symbols here. So one is going to be for the bar representation, another one for the space, this one here, this one is going to be the area, another space, and then the value for that area. For the bar, we're going to be using a get item from list, and we're gonna be using the bar index, and the list in this case is going to be the bars list. Then we're going to add a space here. Basically, we're gonna say a string value, and let's use a string input here to add a space and a colon, a space for formatting purposes. Then we want to display the name of the area. So since the code block is very similar to this one, I'm just gonna copy it and replace the bars with the list called areas. And last, we are going to also append the value of the time that players have been spent in that area. So for that, we're going to be using the area time. And remember, something to notice here is that when I copy the call blocks here, I was also carrying over the value of bar index. But in this case, you want to make sure that you use the correct value, which is the iterator. Just like that. Something to notice here is that when you try to concatenate a string and numbers, you might get an error like this. So in order to solve it, all you have to do is basically replace the value that is going to be producing a number with the code block called variable as a string, and then inside that code block you can then place the value that you want to use as a string, and that'll solve the error. We're gonna then set the value of the iterator to increment by 1. So we're gonna be using set2 iterator to be equals to iterator plus 1. I'm going to be using this value here. And after doing that, we're going to be sending an event with delay to continue the loop. And this is going to be the same event called build message. We're going to be sending it to self. And we're going to be sending this after 0.2 seconds. It doesn't have to be that fast, just to make sure that we don't overload the number of calculations in your world. Otherwise, if we completed that loop, we're going to be then using an else statement to build the last portion of the message. And the last portion of the message is going to be created by using the set2 code block. And we're going to be using the same message variable. For this, we're going to be, again, concatenating values here, and we're going to be using a plus sign for that. We're going to concatenate the message value here with another breakpoint here. So I'm going to copy the same breakpoint symbol that we used before. We're going to use another bar symbol. So for that, I'm going to be using another concatenation symbol here with the plus sign. And I'm going to be using the same code block that I used before get item from bars. But in this case, instead of using the bar index, I'm going to be using a clamp value. So for that, I'm going to be using clamp. And the value that we want to clamp is the result of subtracting the value. I'm going to be using a subtraction here. The value of 10 minus the accumulated value that we have here. And we want to make sure that that value of that clamp subtraction doesn't go either below 0 or more than 10. Perfect. And just like before, we're going to continue concatenating strings here. So we're going to be using a plus sign, and in the A pill, we're going to copy the same symbol that we used before to separate the strings. In this case, we're going to be capturing here everything else that is not the area. So I'm going to be calling this one others. With a space. And then using the call block variable as the string, we're going to end up this message by simply placing a value here that is going to be the subtraction of total time minus total area time. And this is going to give us the total value of the other areas. And the last step here is to use the action call block called display text to display that message on self, which is self is going to be the dashboard. Okay, now that we have the script completed, let's go ahead and complete the layout in the world. So for this part, we're going to be using a trigger zone, and this is going to be the green box here. We're going to make it large enough to cover the area that we want to monitor, and tall enough so we detect when player enters or leaves that area. Then we're going to open the property panel of this trigger, and after you do that, from the part that says attach script, you're going to click on the drop down and then select the one called area script, which is the one that we created this time. From here, in the part that says area name, you're going to assign a key name that is going to be represented for this area. In this case, it's going to be the one called bar. I think is short and good enough. And in the dashboard part, we're going to be connecting the blue pill of the dashboard, right? So we haven't added that to the world yet. So let's go ahead and do that now. So I'm going to open my build menu, and then I'm going to bring a test gizmo that is going to be the dashboard in this case. I'm going to open the properties panels of this test gizmo. And from here, you want to drag the blue pill of the test gizmo into the buckets called dashboard. Let's go ahead and do the same thing for the other areas. And this time it's going to be simply a copy of the trigger. And in this case, you want to rename the prior keyword with the new name of that area. In this case, it's called dance. And we're going to do the same step one more time for the last portion of it. We're going to rename that part that says dance with the corresponding area, in this case, VIP. And that's it for the areas part. So now we're going to be opening the properties of this test gizmo to make sure that we configure the dashboard script. So from here, we want now to select the script called dashboard script. And you'll see that we have all the variables that we created, but we don't have it to do anything with any of those variables because the script is very straightforward and we don't have to manipulate any of this data. After we do this, we open the script menu and then we press play. And if everything is okay, we should start seeing some information in the test gizmo. Perfect, there you go. So something to notice here is that all the information here is crunched. And as I mentioned before, this is something that you're going to have to play with to make sure that it's aligned to the size of the dashboard that you want to create. In my case, I want to create a smaller size of the dashboard, so I'm going to make sure that this test gizmo is smaller in size. So I'm going to make it like really tiny, and I'm going to bring it to avatar size pretty much. And I'm going to reset the world and see how it looks. If I stop the world and then I press play, after 5 seconds or so, we should start seeing some data in here. Okay, perfect, that size is good. Next, let's go ahead and readjust the width of the characters, and we can do that by opening the dashboard script. And in the very first line, when we modify the message, we can modify the value of that M space number that we entered before. Right now is 0.2. So let's add more space in there, and let's change that to be 0.4 instead. Let's stop the world and play it, and let's see how it looks. Okay, that looks a little bit too wide. Let's open the properties of the test gizmo and make sure that we disable the auto fit, so that way we have a standard way of measuring things. And let's see how it looks. If we stop and play the world, that looks okay, but let's just add a little bit more space in there, just looks a tiny bit better. And we can do that by, again, going into the message configuration here, and let's change this one to be 45 maybe, and then stop the world. This is a matter of taste at this point. Now that we have completed the script, let's add some UI elements so we can see the information better. So let's go and add a cube that I am going to change the color to black, and I am going to place this cube behind the dashboard here, and I'm going to resize it to cover all the information like so. Now if I go into the world, we should be able to start seeing how those bars start changing depending on how much time I spent on the different areas. So for example, if I go to the bar area, you should start to see how the bar column starts increasing the number of bars, representing the amount of time that I'm spending in this section. Right next to the name of the bar, there is a number that represents the exact number of seconds that players have spent in this area. And if I go, for example, to the dance floor, the same thing should happen. The dance floor starts increasing the number of bars that represents the amount of time that I'm spending in this area, as well as the number of seconds that should be reflected next to the name of this area. Now, if we go back to the dashboard area, we should be able to see the amount of time that we have spent on each one of those heat map areas. For the bar, I stayed there for 71 seconds, and the dance floor 45 seconds. And everything else is being captured under the others bar, which is the area where I am right now. The bars are a representation of the amount of time that I spent there. As always, it's a proportion, right? So since the others is the one that is increasing right now, the bar for the bar area and the dance area is going to decrease over time, while the others bars are going to increase on the number of quantity, depending on the number of seconds that we have over there. And just like that, this is how you can track the amount of time that your visitors spend in your world and what areas of the world they spend more time in. I'm PigeonNo12. I hope that you enjoyed this script. Thank you for following along, and I cannot wait to see until you implement it in your worlds. This is going to help you to make your worlds more retentive and attractive to your visitors.